In 2016, the Wixoss franchise was gifted a film to celebrate the success of both the card game and its tie-in anime. And in turn, the film itself ended up being celebrated with the release of specially designed decks based on the ones the characters in the film use, specifically White Hope and Black Desire. I actually picked up the Black Desire deck myself some time ago, and the quality and care that went into this is definitely fitting of what was intended to be a celebration of the franchise's success. Looking at you, Nintendo. Take notes. For any other franchise, this film would ultimately end up as yet another lackluster recap film, which is a big part of the reason that I never got around to actually watching the film when it came out. That, and the fact that it was never actually given an official release outside of Japan, at least not to my knowledge. However, after finishing up my two-part analysis of the Selector anime back in January, the idea of finally sitting down to review the movie kept gnawing away at my mind, almost as if I subconsciously knew that there was more to this film than I had previously assumed. Finally, once a friendly commenter confirmed those suspicions for me, I decided that since the next deep dive video was going to take me a fair amount of time to finish up, doing a shorter video about Selector's tie-in film might be a productive way to fill that newfound gap in my schedule. That said, there were two things I plan to do with this video. The first is to compare whatever new content the film may contain to what was already discussed in my previous videos, to see how my analysis of the series stacks up to what was intended to tie up the rest of the series' loose ends, and give its viewer base a concrete resolution to the story. The second is to actually review the film, not based around what it represents for the canon, but simply based on what it is, and what I believe it could have and probably should have been. In either case, an adequate understanding of the events of the first two seasons of Wixoss is required in order to get the most out of watching this video. Specifically, I'm making this under the assumption that you've already seen my previous two videos discussing the franchise. If you haven't, feel free to go and check them out and then come back once you're all caught up. You'll find the links to those videos in the description. As for those of you who are caught up to speed, I'm Octo, and welcome back to my corner, where today we analyze the most obscure part of the Wixoss anime library, Selector Destructed Wixoss. Welcome aboard. Last time I talked about Selector, I made it a point to discuss how the main heroine of this series, Ruko, has a deep-rooted fear of being a burden on those around her. I also explained the reasoning behind this, but in so doing made it clear that aside from a snippet of conversation between Ruko's birth mother and her grandma, none of that reasoning is ever explicitly stated or dwelt on within the show itself. While all of that still holds true in relation to the series, Selector Destructed Wixoss actually makes it a point to make all of this common knowledge within the first 20 minutes, which I suppose is the reason why that information about her past has been on the fan wiki all of this time, despite not being explicitly stated anywhere within the first two seasons. Anyway, because this relates to my overall analysis, it stands to reason that we should discuss that first. But in order for that to happen, we'll also need to discuss a new character that was introduced within the film. So consider this your official spoiler warning if you haven't seen Selector Destructed Wixoss and have any plans to in the future. Anyway, all warnings aside, let's turn back the clock and analyze the opening moments of Selector Destructed Wixoss. It's a bright, sunny day. Likely the end of spring or the beginning of summer. Though, admittedly, the exact time doesn't matter much in the grand scheme of things. A girl pokes and prods at some object of interest, while the look on her face paints a clear, antagonizing picture of her character, before she even gets the chance to speak. A fierce argument echoes from within a nearby home, the subject of which is alluded to being the girl herself, and if you listen closely, piecing together the nature of this scene is not at all difficult to do. As the pieces of the puzzle fall into place, and we realize this young girl is in the process of being adopted by her relatives, another child enters the picture. Wide-eyed, innocent. This is a girl who is unfamiliar with tragedy of any caliber, and when compared to what we've just seen and heard, the difference between the two couldn't be any more clear. The innocent child is Sachi, while the one who gives off a more sinister aura is named Rumi. Sachi, in typical childlike curiosity, eagerly approaches Rumi to find out what has so fully captured her new friend's attention. That's when another clear difference between the two is made strikingly clear. When Sachi sees what Rumi has been poking at, she doesn't respond with the same morbid intrigue that we saw Rumi display just moments ago. Rather, her response to the sight is immediate sympathy, stating that she, quote, feels bad for it. Mere moments later, we finally bear witness to what the it in question really is, and our inferences about who these characters are is cemented. You see, what has created such differing reactions among these two children is this. An injured butterfly, slowly dying alone in the shadow of the house. Rumi beckons to Sachi, a motion which the child sees as an invitation to go someplace that isn't tainted by death or sadness. In other words, Sachi views this gesture as a chance to get to know her cousin, who will, as of now, also be living with her, based on the disgruntled chatter of Sachi's mother and father within the house. Unfortunately for Sachi, that excitement would soon turn to despair. As the two walk together, we are treated to more cleverly executed details about these two characters. Rumi bites her nails, a sign that she is stressed, anxious, and unhappy. Sachi misunderstands this nibbling as just a bad habit, and tells Rumi that she shouldn't bite her nails like that. Rumi stops, and when she does, we can visibly see her facial expression change, even if the framing prevents us from seeing the full picture. This is a face of realization, meant to represent Rumi coming to a certain conclusion about her cousin Sachi. This is the second time Sachi has failed to understand her, and the reality of what that means is beginning to sink in. In an effort to reflect this, the framing of the shot of the two girls walking together is deliberately metaphorical. Rumi leads the way, while Sachi lags behind. This is, at first glance, nothing short of obvious, because Rumi was the one who told Sachi to follow her in the first place, but there's more to this moment than just that. Rumi feels that she is one step ahead of Sachi. She understands the fragility of life, while Sachi is as of yet untainted by the stains of life-changing tragedy. They are unable to connect, to form a bond with one another, because Rumi views herself as being above Sachi, and likewise, Sachi seems to look up to Rumi with the kind of wonder and awe you would expect from the mind of a child. As they reach a busy intersection, Rumi gives Sachi one final chance to understand her. Pointing to the kanji for happiness, she explains that this is the symbol for which Sachi was named, causing young Sachi to praise Rumi for her knowledge of such things, and giving Rumi her full attention in the process. In response, Rumi points out that there is but a very small difference between the kanji for happiness and painfulness. In fact, the only thing that you need to do to change one to the other is to remove a single pillar from the character. Likely realizing that Sachi hasn't understood the meaning of her words, Rumi states her message as clearly as she possibly can. And then, to make the meaning even more clear, Rumi lets go of Sachi's hand, running into the street and into oncoming traffic. Her final words prior to this acting as instruction to let the meaning of her actions sink in. Feel the pain. If it wasn't already clear from the by now synonymous facial expression, the girl known as Rumi and the Elrig known as Urith are one and the same. Rather than being hit and killed when she sprints into the street, Rumi's actions instead nearly cause a massive traffic accident, as the world gifts her sympathy for what is in all likelihood the very first time. Regardless of the result, however, Rumi does not return to Sachi that day. She leaves her alone in an unfamiliar part of town, and seemingly dismisses the idea of doing anything to help her cousin find her way home. Now completely alone, Sachi can finally understand what Rumi meant. Happiness is only one step away from pain. Or to put it in the words of a character who is much more widely known, all it takes is one bad day to ruin someone's life for good. This is where we shift gears for a moment, and find ourselves in a very familiar situation on the other side of town. A girl sits alone, outside of a home, unintentionally eavesdropping on a conversation between her birth mother and her grandmother. This girl, as I'm sure you already know, is Ruko. From here, what Ruko hears from her mother gives her the impression that her mother wishes she'd never been born, something she's heard before, but something which now takes on a completely different meaning. Perhaps because it was only moments ago that, potentially for the first time, Ruko asked her mother for ice cream.
Mama, ice tabetai.
It makes her think that it was because she asked something of her mother that her mother views her existence as a burden, and this is further confirmed when Ruko goes to the convenience store with her brother that very same day. When her grandmother becomes worried about what the children might think if they were to overhear the discussion, she offers Ruko a total of 1,000 yen to go buy herself and her brother a treat from the nearby convenience store. On my first viewing, this entire sequence confused me, because I had figured that Ru asking for ice cream and getting rejected for it was the moment when she became emotionally distant. But during my second viewing, I came up with what I believe is a much more accurate take on what is actually happening here. We know based on statements that Ruko's brother Ayumu makes throughout this sequence that they are, as of now, officially living with their grandmother instead of their birth mother. And it's clear almost immediately that this is something that bothers Ayumu a lot more than it does Ruko, which makes sense given the clear age gap between the two. Both of these children walk alone until they find their way to the local park and quickly form a close bond. It's also during this interaction that the audience is treated to the results of their mutual abandonment and the psychological impact, which it has already had, on their respective thought processes. When Ruko finally meets Sachi in the park, the two end up remedying their loneliness by going out together to find a place to buy ice cream. As we can see, the money originally intended to go toward buying a treat for both Ayumu and Ruko has gone unused, which means that Ruko has now experienced abandonment 2 times, a parallel to what the young Sachi has gone through that same day. When Ayumu left her behind and told her to walk home alone, he had also begrudgingly said that they would both need to change their names soon, a statement brought on by the way Ayumu's friends call out to him by his last name, a name he won't be carrying for much longer. As a quick side note, I'd like to point out that getting to see Ayumu have some sort of character development, and getting to see through careful direction and well-done animation details on how he copes with losing what he previously understood to be his family, is something that I wholeheartedly appreciate. Yes, Ayumu did have a clear character up until now, but getting to delve a little deeper into that when we previously weren't able to do so also serves as a way to tell us more about the family that we would come to know at the start of Selector Infected Wixoss. For example, before the two left for the convenience store, Ayumu is seen playing Tetris on what is probably the most bootleg-looking handheld I've ever seen, likely manufactured by Tiger Electronics or Jakks Pacific. What's important, though, isn't who made the handheld, it's the fact that, in time, this gaming device would become the way that Grandma would come to bond with Ruko and Ayumu, and that, as a result, the family would end up playing games together often, which is likely how they ended up as close-knit as they are in the series proper. We can also kind of tell that Ayumu harbors a resentment toward Ruko, at least to some degree, because as you may remember, not being able to understand what Ruko's thought process was the very thing that led to this situation in the first place, and that's probably why Ruko asks for ice cream to begin with as well. She's trying to change based on what her mother had said to her before. However, because this is a change that comes too late, her fear of being a burden on others when she asks for things isn't cured by this action, it's reaffirmed. But anyway, back to the park scene. After enjoying some much-needed ice cream together, Ruko asks Sachi for her name. Eager to make a new friend, but after what Rumi has just exposed her to, Sachi now prefers to stay distant, refusing to tell Ruko her name because of what is now a dark memory associated solely with it. Ruko, of course, takes this personally, and for a split second both parties are reaffirmed in their emotional doubts. Noticing this, and attempting to make Ruko feel less distant towards Sachi, she asks Ruko for her name instead, hoping that she can explain without words that her name is something of a sensitive topic at the moment. As we know already, however, Ruko's family name has been made something of a sensitive subject for her by her older brother, something we can tell just by listening to the way she reflects on her older brother's words while walking alone to the park in this shot.
お名前って生まれた時に決まってるんじゃないの?
And so, in the end, neither girl knows the name of their newest friend, and in an effort to remedy that lack of ability to connect with a name, Sachi chooses the name Tama, after the name of the city the story takes place in. As it happens, this is where the name Tama came from in the first place. As you'll recall, it was Ruko who named her Elrig, rather than the other way around. From here on out, we cut to a brief intermission of sorts, and this is where the recap portion of the film starts to set in. Speaking of recap, within the bizarre confines of the anime fandom, the words recap film seem to mean different things to different people. While the majority of anime fans are quick to accept these recap films as at the very least skippable bonus features that have the potential to raise awareness for the franchise in question, live-action anime is rarely accepted, and as much as I'd love to get into a discussion about that today, it's really not the reason why we're here. So I'll just add it to the list of videos I'd like to make at some point and hopefully get back to it someday. Anyway, regardless of how you feel about the concept of recap films, I think we can all agree that aside from extremely rare cases, these recap films are not to be taken as suitable replacements for the remainder of the franchise, and this film is no exception. While it starts out with a beautiful opening scene and contains a great deal of new moments and animation, I can't say that changes the fact that, at its core, Selector Destructed Wixoss is a recap film, and the majority of its runtime is spent doing exactly that, recapping the events of Seasons 1 and 2. Unlike with the Attack on Titan or Madoka Magica films, this recap isn't simply adapted into a shorter version of the story for the film, it's literally a narrator recounting the events accompanied by flashbacks to those moments. It is recap in the least engaging sense, and as a fan of Wixoss I have to admit that it is a little disappointing. It isn't that the film is bad, because the new concepts and story elements introduced are anything but, something I hope my in-depth analysis of the film's opening segment has illustrated for you. My issue is simply that Selector Destructed Wixoss is a movie rather than a series of OVAs or its own standalone miniseries. For example, when Attack on Titan chose to cover events from the past and shed new light on moments the audience had already seen, they made OVAs about it. In fact, as of this moment, Attack on Titan contains a total of 83 episodes, as of the time of me writing this, and of those 83, 8 of them are OVAs. That means that roughly 9% of the entire series is relegated to OVA content, and not a single one of those OVAs is skippable or unimportant. Each tells an important piece of the overall narrative, from the story of how Levi Ackerman came to be the man we see in the series proper, to what Annie Leonhardt actually did with her time once she joined the MPs in Central. These episodes are exciting, and they do what any good episode of a series should do. They further the characters, and they further the overall narrative. Now let's compare that to Selector Destructed Wixoss. Obviously, there's enough new content here to fill a full OVA episode, potentially even 2 OVAs, but not quite a full-length movie. While it's true that this content is designed around the fact that Destructed is a recap movie, and this decision helps give the film a slightly different feel than your typical recap film, those gestures are ultimately not enough to make the recap feel interesting. I watched this film twice while making this video, and during my second viewing, I just ended up skipping past all of the recap, because if you've seen the series proper, you have nothing to gain from listening to Mayu recount the events of the first and second seasons, though the added interactions between characters, especially when it comes to Urith, were admittedly very pleasant touch. Now that I've given my thoughts on the recap portion of the film, I think it's only fair for me to analyze the remainder of the Selector Destructed Wixoss's new content, and see how it stacks up to what I've said about the series thus far. One of the most unique aspects of Selector Destructed Wixoss, as opposed to the rest of the franchise, is how it treats its antagonistic force, Urith. Specifically, Destructed added a lot of extra moments that help to explain why Urith is the way that she is. And while we already covered one of them in adequate detail, the time has come to discuss the other interesting aspects of the series. One very important idea, that I forgot to discuss previously, is the theory that Urith's wish is to become the Girl of Black, because of her love for human suffering. Simply put, Urith wants free reign to enact evil upon the Selectors, because doing so gives her the feeling that she, for once in her life, has control over the others. As up until now, she's never felt in control of anything, least of all her own life. That's why when she gains control over Iona's body, she ends up becoming so, for lack of a better term, controlling. In a scene unique to Selector Destructed Wixoss, we get to bear full witness to the unabridged version of a battle we saw unfold briefly within the main series during Season 2. Urith unapologetically wipes the floor with her opponent, crushing her in the most cruel of ways she can possibly think of during the match. It's within these moments that we are granted a conversation between Tama and the opposing Elrig as they clash in battle, and the conversation they have is incredibly telling of what it's like to battle with someone so sinister as Urith.
あの子いい子
いい子だよ。
気持ちつらくない？
そうだね。でも、きっと彼女は負けるから。
It's clear that this type of battling is something Tama doesn't want, something painful and beyond what she had previously understood of the game. At the inevitable conclusion, which plays out exactly as the opposing Elrig had feared, we learn more about what Urith's true nature is, and the idea of her wanting the power to control others through her manipulation is repeatedly brought up over the next few scenes. This explains the Akira situation from Season 2, at least in part, but we can actually go a tad deeper than that and explain it fully. On that day back in their childhood, when Urith was still a mere child by the name of Rumi, when she abandoned Sachi and sprinted toward what she thought would surely be her death, a group of responsible adults... What is an adult? Adults returned Sachi to her mother in the dead of night. Just before that moment occurred, however, the tragic reality of Rumi's life at home is made clear to us, as we get to have a look inside the house. Sachi's birth mother, and by extension, Rumi's aunt, is seen physically beating Rumi for abandoning the one who was entrusted to her care. A quick glance at the table shows that while there are supposedly 3 members of this family at this point in time, Rumi, Sachi, and their mother, dinner is only set aside for 2. After a particularly impactful blow, Rumi lies in pain on the floor, in the same position as we later see Hitoe in after Akira hurts her. This moment serves as a potential explanation for the way Urith responds when she sees what Akira has done. It's entirely possible that what we've seen of her past is the very reason behind Urith's poison of choice being manipulation. And now that Akira has crossed over from psychological torment to physical abuse, she needs to be put in her place. It also may be that this is the reason Urith was fond of Akira to begin with, because of Akira's wish to see Iona ruined, and how Akira reacts when she finds out that in the end, Iona was the one who ruined herself. This could explain Urith's monologue about how external scars are ugly, while internal or hidden wounds are much more palatable. I do have to admit, though, that this is still a detail about which I'm not 100% certain. There could be any number of other explanations, and there's more to unpack than just what I've discussed, so if you have a prevailing theory about Urith that differs from mine, please feel free to share that in the comments, because that is a discussion that I honestly would really love to have. Regardless of that detail, however, the way the film ends gives us little doubt about who Urith truly is, or I suppose, given the context of the film, was. Urith preferred manipulation because it was some way to gain control over people. She knew that no matter how nice people pretended to be to her, abandoning her was what they truly wanted. She overheard her aunt talking about how she didn't want her before the two had even properly been introduced. So by acting like the creature she was made out to be by others, all she was doing was forcing them to be honest. It's entirely likely that she never actually wanted to hurt anyone, but after being hurt so much at such a young age, the only way to remedy that hurt was to make others hate her. Because at the very least, when people said they hated her, or called her a heartless monster, she knew that they weren't lying. It hurts to be alone, or so the saying goes, but if the alternative is worse than loneliness, if it's hatred, then maybe being alone wouldn't be so bad after all. This is why when Sachi refuses to be mean to her, even after all she's done to control her, Rumi grows a deep-seated hatred for Sachi, and eventually torments her until she attempts suicide by jumping off of a building. Sachi survived this, however, and when visiting the now comatose body of the only person who ever seemed to truly care for her, Urith fights an emotion she doesn't understand by laughing it off, and verbally assaulting an elderly woman who tries to express sympathy for her in some way. In Urith's eyes, this person doesn't understand. This person couldn't understand, because this is one of the very people whom Urith hates so much. This person, she thinks, must surely just be another liar. After dealing with this in her own way, Urith declares her wish has been granted. And this is where, just steps outside of the hospital, Urith seems to willingly return Iona's body, and this would also explain how she ended up as the new Girl of Black, and by extension, Mayu's Elrig. In the end, Sachi too became an eternal girl. And in the aftermath of the final match of Season 2, as she fades away for what is almost certainly the last time, a hand reaches out and grabs her own. Sachi's only wish was for Urith to not be alone, and she has sacrificed everything to be with her for all of eternity, even as a formless entity within the endless void. Urith, of course, rejects this at first. Nobody has cared for her until this point. Why would they care now? But as we fade to black and the two disappear, we, along with Urith herself, finally understand. Sachi was never lying, and Urith is never going to be alone again. So in the end, Urith was evil, but she was only evil because she had been made to be so by those around her. If all the world was ever going to do was abandon her, her only solace could come in the form of control via manipulation. They wouldn't be the ones to choose when they abandoned her. She would. And yet, as she fades with Sachi into the void, it's hard to imagine anything else being on her mind but regret. If Sachi had been genuine, who else had been? Of course, all of this is my own speculation, because ultimately it doesn't really matter what she's thinking in the end. What matters is that before the end, she was given compassion, despite all of her evil doings. At long last, the hurt has started to go away, and Urith can finally, after all of this time, begin to heal. In all honesty, there isn't much left to unpack about the events of Selector beyond what became of Urith in the end. The aftermath of the final match is shown to us, and I must admit it is heartwarming to finally have closure on the events of the series, even if it doesn't feel entirely necessary. In the case of ambiguous anime endings, a lot of faith can be placed in the concept of aimai, or reading between the lines of ambiguity. I think it was safe to harbor the assumption at the end of Selector Spread Wixoss that everything did end up working out for the characters in the end. Because if it hadn't, then it's safe to assume that we would have been shown something to that effect. Just because a series doesn't explicitly show you something, doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And while there's definitely a point to be made that anime in general suffers from the dreaded read the manga ending a frustrating amount of the time, I wasn't of the opinion that Selector was one of those franchises, and I felt that the ending of Season 2 gave me enough closure to be truly happy with. Is what I thought I would say after finishing the film. But I think my reaction to actually seeing that closure is proof that while those may have been my initial thoughts about getting a proper ending to the Selector series, the film managed to, shall we say, pleasantly surprise me. Gosh, is that? My girl's okay, she's alive! Yeah! From what we see here, there is a tad more to unpack about these characters, and where the film is implying they plan to go next, and in general, who they are now that the game is finally over. In a scene eerily reminiscent of a moment from the series' first season, we see Ruko, Yuzuki, and Hitoe playing a very non-selector-oriented game of Wixoss, and enjoying playing the game for just the sake of playing it, something that they now realize is much better than the kind of high-adrenaline battles they participated in before. Where Ruko previously complained about cards not being quite as exciting, it's clear from her actions that this thought has, by now, all but vanished completely in her mind. Akira is shown to be doing just fine, and is now friends with the girl who was once her Elrig, and I have to be honest, I have no idea how that's possible, because I was under the impression that these two hated each other, but after all she has been tormented by, maybe Akira is just happy to get a second chance at life. And now, having learned from her mistakes, is choosing to be the type of friendly person toward others that she always truly wanted to be, now that the scars of her past have been erased completely. It's not a concrete theory, but it is a theory, and it's the only way I can make sense of it. Either way, I'm sure this made somebody in the fanbase happy, at the very least. Chiori and Eldora seem to be getting along great, and even Fumio Futase, the tragic author from Season 2, has had her wish granted, something reaffirmed by this shot of the two standing together, content now that they can act as one another's mutual support group. Then there's Hitoe, and before I get into Hitoe, I'm going to need to break down a previous moment of dialogue that happened between the now human characters of Hanayo and Midoriko. While Hanayo states that she would rather not interact with her old Selector, choosing instead to write the events off as just a bad dream that she'd sooner forget, and for good reason, might I add, Midoriko's point of view seems to reflect Hitoe's, almost to a T. Like Hitoe, Midoriko had never been much of a social butterfly, and had had trouble making friends. Unlike Hitoe, however, this was something that she was totally okay with. She accepted her lot in life, and chose instead to embrace the life of a recluse, but when she met Hitoe and saw how the same situation could be interpreted and responded to so differently by another person, she made the choice to help Hitoe in any way she could. This explains why, when Hitoe loses to Iona and becomes tainted by the game in Season 1, Midoriko fades away in the rain, lamenting that any punishment she could receive for tainting such a pure and innocent wish would be far too kind. Given that Hitoe herself considered Midoriko a friend, and Midoriko understood this, it only makes sense for her to seek her out and find her now, And when the two meet on the train, Hitoe's reaction to finally being able to truly be friends with someone whom, in her eyes, supported her during the hardest time of her life, is something that she feels nothing but gratitude for. In the end, despite the evils of the game, Hitoe and Midoriko both view Selector battles as something they are grateful for, something they feel has made them stronger, better people, now able to overcome what had previously held them back. In fact, Hitoe's monologue in this scene is such a profound reflection of this point that I actually assumed the credits would begin rolling right then and there. But alas, we've got one more pair of Selector and Elrig to catch up with, and though it isn't the most impactful, it is the most important, because it represents the completion of the goal we've been fighting for since the ending of Season 1, Tama and Ruko. It's nice to see Tama get to be a part of Ruko's life as a real person rather than a card. Though I have to admit I could have gone without seeing Tama literally drink Ruko's tears off of her face. That was a bit weird. Why did they do that? While it's true that there's a lot of metaphors happening in these final moments of the film, and even the tear-licking shot has some level of significance to it, it wouldn't do anything to change the overall meaning that this ending seems to carry. For a great number of Selectors, even for the antagonist of the series, all any of them really needed was a shoulder to cry on, and a friend to help them through their struggles. It was thanks to Ruko's realization of this that what was previously considered impossible is now a definite reality. And it's why I consider Destructed, while definitely full of recap, to be a worthwhile addition to the franchise. In the end, I think this is the ending that a lot of people wanted to see for Selector, myself included. In my opinion, what we should have got was an OVA for the all-new content, but all things considered, I find myself left with very few complaints. It's also nice that the added dialogue from Mayu and the way the ending decided to explain the concepts behind the game creation basically confirmed both of my previous videos as 100% accurate. And that was a confidence booster, let me tell you. Oh, except for my little Urith theory here, this was wrong. But other than that, most of what I said was right on the money, and I'd be lying if I said having my suspicions confirmed wasn't at least a little exciting. That said, I do have just one question left unanswered, and unfortunately for me, it was probably the question I wanted answered the most. What happened to Kazuki? Did he really end up with his sister, or did Hanayo go snap him out of it after she became human again? Are those two considered rivals or something? Are you alright, man?